Last night you dreamed something you have never seen, not something unfamiliar in the ordinary sense, not a face you haven't met or a place you haven't visited, something stranger than that, something that arrived in your sleeping mind with the weight of ancient significance, a symbol that felt loaded with meaning you couldn't quite name, a figure that seemed to know you better than you knew yourself, an image that, when you woke, left a residue. Not quite fear, not quite wonder, something between the two, that stayed with you through the morning without attaching itself to any explanation. Where did that come from? You didn't invent it. You know you didn't invent it. It arrived, fully formed, from somewhere beneath the ordinary traffic of your daily thought, from somewhere beneath the memories of yesterday and the plans for tomorrow and the running commentary of the conscious mind that narrates your waking life, from somewhere deeper than personal experience, deeper than anything you have lived or learned or been told. From where? This is not a small question. It is, in fact, one of the most important questions in the entire history of psychology. And the man who spent his life pursuing it, who followed it down into territories that most of his contemporaries considered either too speculative or too dangerous or simply too strange to follow, arrived at an answer so vast and so unsettling that it has never been fully absorbed. Not by the field of psychology, not by philosophy, not by the culture that has been, for a century now, quietly shaped by its implications without fully acknowledging the source. Carl Gustav Jung, Swiss, born 1875, died 1961. A man who began his career as a brilliant protege of Sigmund Freud and ended it as something that does not fit neatly into any category, not purely scientist, not purely philosopher, not purely mystic, though he touched all three. A man who had a dream in 1909 that changed the direction of his thinking, and, through his thinking, the direction of how the 20th century understood the human interior. The dream is worth hearing. He dreamed he was in a house, his house, he assumed, but as he explored it, he found himself descending through floors he had not known existed. The upper floors were familiar and contemporary, the ordinary furniture of a modern European mind. But descending, the floors became older, medieval, Roman, and then, at the lowest level, a cave hewn from rock, with prehistoric pottery and two human skulls on the floor, ancient, pre-personal, there before him, before his family, before his civilization. He woke understanding something that would take decades to articulate fully. The house was the psyche, and the psyche had flaws that went much deeper than personal experience, flaws that predated not just the individual life but the civilization around it, flaws that contained something shared, not the private contents of one person's history, but the accumulated inheritance of the entire species, structural patterns, ancient images, the recurring figures and forms that appear across every culture and every century, in dreams and myths and religions and art. He called this the collective unconscious, and the word collective is doing more work in that phrase than it might first appear. Not collective in the way that language is collective, shared by convention, learned through exposure, transmitted through culture, but collective in a deeper, stranger, more disturbing sense, innate, inherited, present in every human being, not because it was passed down through story or education or cultural transmission, but because it is part of the structure of being human, part of the architecture of the psyche itself, as given as the structure of the body, as universal as the capacity for language, or grief, or the recognition of a face. You were born with it, not with its specific contents, not with particular memories or particular images ready-made, but with the structural predispositions, the templates, the potentials for certain universal patterns of experience, the potential to encounter the figure that Jung calls the Great Mother, the potential to be confronted by the shadow, the potential to be guided by the wise old man or the trickster or the hero, the potential to experience the self, the organizing center of the whole psyche, as something that transcends the ego and yet is more fully you than the ego has ever been. These potentials are not metaphors, not literary devices, not simply patterns that recur because human situations recur and similar situations produce similar responses. They are, Jung argues, structural features of the unconscious psyche. Real in the way that the liver is real, not visible in ordinary experience, not available to direct inspection, but doing genuine work in the organism, shaping experience from below. But here's the strange part. If the collective unconscious is real, if there is, beneath every individual human mind, a layer of psychic structure that is shared across the species, then the boundaries of the individual self are not where ordinary thinking places them. You think of yourself as ending at your skin, as beginning when you were born and ending when you die, as containing within your personal history the relevant material that makes you what you are, your memories, your relationships, your traumas and your joys, your conscious beliefs and your personal fears. Jung is telling you that you are also something larger than all of this, not instead of it, in addition to it. That beneath the personal history, but beneath the biography that you call yourself, there is something that was there before you were born and will be there after you die. Not you exactly, not the individual, but the substrate from which you and every other human being are built. And that substrate is not silent. It speaks, in dreams, in fantasies, in the irrational emotional responses that ambush you without adequate cause, in the myths you find inexplicably moving, in the religious images that retain their power over people who no longer consciously believe in them, in the moments of synchronicity that feel, against all rational defense, like meaning. It speaks in the dream you didn't invent. Jung spent his entire career learning to listen to that voice, learning to distinguish the speech of the collective unconscious from the noise of personal anxiety and personal desire, developing a method for engaging with the ancient images not as symptoms to be explained away, but as genuine communications from a layer of the psyche that deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. What he found there was not comfortable, was not always safe, was, on multiple occasions, so overwhelming that it threatened his psychological stability. The years of what he called the confrontation with the unconscious, the period following his break with Freud documented in the Red Book, were years in which the depth opened beneath him with a force and a richness that brought him to the edge of what was navigable. He navigated it, not perfectly, not without cost, but he came back with a map. And the map is what we are going to follow, through the layers, through the archetypes, through the shadow and the anima and the self, through the question of what it means to be an individual who is also, always, something more and something older than the individual, through the ocean beneath every mind, the ocean that was there before you arrived, and will be there when you are gone. Before Jung, the unconscious had a different shape. Freud had discovered it, or rather, had given the West its most influential modern account of it. And Freud's unconscious was, at its core, a repository, a storage facility for the things that conscious life could not hold. The repressed, the forbidden, the desires and the traumas and the memories had been pushed below the threshold of awareness because they were too threatening, too shameful, too incompatible with the conscious self-image to remain in plain sight. Freud's unconscious was essentially personal, a basement full of the individual's own discarded material. The contents were specific to each person, their childhood, their family dynamics, their particular constellation of forbidden desires. If you wanted to understand what was in the basement, you needed the individual's history, you needed the specific story of how the specific material had been repressed. Jung accepted all of this. He did not reject the personal unconscious, he built on it. He agreed that there is a personal unconscious, a layer of the psyche that contains the material specific to this individual's life, repressed or simply forgotten, or simply never fully processed. This layer is real, its effects are real, the therapeutic work of bringing its contents into consciousness is genuinely valuable and genuinely possible. But he could not make the personal unconscious explain everything he was seeing. In the dreams and fantasies of his patients, in his own interior explorations, in the comparative study of mythology and religion and alchemy and anthropology that he pursued with a scholarly intensity that alarmed more clinically minded colleagues, he kept encountering something that did not fit the personal unconscious model. Images too ancient for the patient's personal history, symbols from traditions the patient had no access to, narrative structures that recurred not just in one person's dreams but in the dreams of people across cultures separated by centuries and oceans. The motif of the hero's journey, the figure of the terrible mother who both creates and destroys, the wise old man who appears at the threshold of significant transition, the trickster who disrupts and transforms, the divine child born in unlikely circumstances who represents the possibility of renewal, the dragon or the serpent guarding the treasure, the descent into the underworld and the return. These appear in the Greek myths, in the Norse myths, in African mythology, in Native American traditions, in Hindu sacred texts, in Christian iconography, in Chinese folklore, in the stories told by Aboriginal Australians, in the dreams of educated Europeans who had never studied mythology. How? Diffusion theory, the idea that the similarities are explained by cultural contact, by myths spreading from a single origin through trade and migration, cannot account for the similarities in traditions too geographically and chronologically separated for contact. And more importantly, it cannot account for their appearance in the dreams of individuals with no cultural exposure to the relevant traditions. Jung's answer is the collective unconscious, not a personal basement but a shared foundation, not a repository of individual repression, but an inheritance of species-level psychic structure. Not the contents of one life, but the templates through which all human lives are shaped. He calls these templates archetypes. The word comes from Greek, arche, beginning, origin, primary. Typos, imprint, pattern, form, archetype, the primary pattern, the original form from which all instances are derived. But Jung is careful, not always careful enough for his critics, but careful, to distinguish between the archetype itself and the archetypal image. The archetype in itself is not an image, is not a picture or a story or a specific symbolic form. It is a predisposition, a structural tendency, the potential for the certain patterns of experience to arise under certain conditions. Think of it this way. Every human being has a potential for language. Not a specific language, not English or Mandarin or Swahili, but the structural capacity for language. The neurological and cognitive architecture that makes language acquisition possible, indeed almost inevitable, given normal developmental conditions. You are born with this capacity. It is not cultural in origin, it is biological, and yet it only expresses itself in and through specific cultural forms, specific languages, specific vocabularies, specific grammatical structures that are learned through immersion in a particular community. The archetype is analogous, the structural potential is innate, universal, part of the equipment of being human, but the specific form it takes, the specific image or narrative or symbol through which it expresses itself, is culturally inflected, shaped by the particular tradition and the particular life in which it appears. The archetype of the Great Mother is universal. The specific images through which she appears, the Virgin Mary, Kali, Isis, the Earth Mother of indigenous traditions, are culturally specific expressions of the same underlying structural potential. Now think about this for a moment. If Jung is right, if the archetypes are real, if they are structural features of the human psyche inherited across the species, then the relationship between the individual and the cultural becomes much more complex than either pure individualism or pure cultural determinism allows. You're not simply what your personal history has made you. You're not simply what your culture has shaped you to be. You're also the expression, in a particular time and place and body, of patterns that are millions of years old. Patterns that were being shaped in the earliest human communities, when the distinction between the sacred and the ordinary had not yet been drawn, when the figure appearing in the dream was met with the same seriousness as the event occurring in waking life. Those patterns have not gone anywhere. They have not been superseded by modernity. They have not been made irrelevant by science or technology or the secularization of Western culture. They have gone underground, which is exactly what underground means in this context, into the unconscious, where they continue their work, shaping experience from below, pressing up through the surface in dreams and symptoms and the irrational intensities that attach to certain images and situations without any adequate personal reason. The man who feels, at the sight of a particular type of woman, an overwhelming response that no analysis of his personal history fully explains. The woman who finds herself in a moment of significant transition, drawn to an older man who seems to know things, not any specific thing, but in general, to radiate a quality of knowing that is not proportionate to his apparent qualities. The child who is terrified without experience of the dark. The collective response to certain symbols, the cross, the swastika, the circle, the serpent, that persists across cultures and across the rational objections of people who know perfectly well that a symbol is just a symbol, but the body disagrees, the dream disagrees, the depth of the response disagrees, and the disagreement is the archetype pressing up, making itself known, in the only language it has, the language of image and emotion and the recognition that arrives before understanding. There is a part of you that you have been refusing to know since before you can remember. Not the ordinary self-ignorance of a person who hasn't reflected enough. Not the specific blind spots that therapy might address with sufficient time and honesty, something more structural than either. The shadow, in Jung's precise, technical, carefully argued sense, is not simply what you don't know about yourself. It is what you have decided you are not. The distinction matters. The shadow is constituted by exclusion, by the ongoing act of self-definition that every developing human being performs in the process of constructing a workable identity. To become a self that can function in the social world, that can be recognized by others, that can maintain consistent relationships, that can pursue goals across time, you have to be some things and not others. You have to develop certain qualities and suppress others. You have to include certain impulses in the acceptable self and push others below the threshold of acknowledgement. What gets pushed below is not random. It is shaped first by the specific demands of the specific environment in which you were formed. The family that rewarded compliance and punished aggression taught you that aggression is not part of who you are. The family that rewarded intellectual achievement and dismissed emotion taught you that vulnerability is not part of who you are. The culture that celebrates certain kinds of strength and pathologizes certain kinds of need shaped the acceptable self in its image. But it is also shaped by something beyond the personal, because the archetypes include the shadow, the potential for darkness, for cruelty, for selfishness, for the full range of human destructive capacity is as much a part of the collective inheritance as the potential for heroism or love. Every human being carries the structural potential for the worst of what human beings have done, not as a personal failing, as the other side of the species. And the shadow is the sum of everything, personal and archetypal, that the conscious self has refused to identify with. Now here is what makes this not merely uncomfortable but genuinely important. The shadow does not disappear when refused. Jung is emphatic about this with a clinical insistence born of watching the consequences across decades of practice. The contents excluded from consciousness do not dissolve. They accumulate. They develop in the unconscious a kind of autonomous existence, a coherence, a pattern of motivation, a will of their own. They press against the walls of the conscious self. They find expression in ways that the conscious self does not acknowledge as its own. The most common and the most destructive of these is projection. You take the quality that you have refused to acknowledge in yourself and you see it in others. With extraordinary clarity, with disproportionate emotional intensity, with a vehemence that makes the perception feel like moral clarity, but is actually something else, the disowned self, recognized in someone else, triggering the full force of the repudiation that keeps it out of consciousness. The man who has refused to acknowledge his own cowardice becomes an expert in the cowardice of others. The woman who has excluded her own capacity for manipulation from her self-image becomes acutely sensitive to the manipulation of the people around her. The person who has locked away their sexuality in the basement of the shadow becomes obsessively concerned with the sexuality of others, morally outraged perhaps, or rigidly judgmental. Because what is denied the light does not simply disappear into neutral storage, it becomes charged, pressurized, and it discharges through projection with a force proportionate to the energy that has been invested in the exclusion. But here's the strange part. Jung does not present the shadow primarily as a problem to be solved. He presents it as a resource that has been mismanaged. The qualities that end up in the shadow are not, in themselves, pathological. Aggression, real aggression, the capacity for genuine force and the willingness to use it when necessary, is not pathological. It is part of the full range of human capacity. Suppressed, refused, projected outward, it becomes destructive. Integrated, brought into consciousness, acknowledged as part of the self, related to rather than denied, it becomes available energy, strength, the capacity to protect what matters, the force that makes real commitment possible rather than the performing of commitment without the will to back it. The shadow is not the enemy. The shadow is the repository of everything the persona decided it couldn't use, and the persona, in excluding the shadow, has not made itself stronger. It has made itself smaller, more defended, less real, less fully alive in the way that a person who contains their contradictions rather than suppressing them is more fully alive than a person who has resolved the contradictions by amputating half of their complexity. Jung calls the process of engaging with the shadow moral work. Not because it is primarily about morality in the conventional sense, but because it requires the kind of honesty that is harder than following rules, the kind of honesty that looks at your own darkness, at your own capacity for exactly what you have been most loudly condemning in others, and says, "This is also me." Not, "This is me and I surrender to it." Not, "This is me and I must now act on every dark impulse I have been suppressing." But, "This is me, and I am responsible for it, and relating to it honestly is the only path that does not produce the specific destruction of the person who carries a large shadow they refuse to know. Now think about this for a moment. Think about the collective dimension of this, because the shadow is not only a personal phenomenon, it has a collective face. The things that a culture excludes from its collective self-image, the darkness that a civilization refuses to acknowledge as its own, these accumulate in exactly the same way as the personal shadow. They develop pressure. They find expression in projection, in the identification of other groups, other nations, other races, other religions as the repository of what the culture refuses to see in itself. The history of human violence is substantially the history of collective shadow projection. The other as the enemy, the stranger as the threat, the group that carries all the qualities, the greed, the cunning, the brutality, the lust, that the projecting group has most emphatically excluded from its self-image. Jung watched this happen in Nazi Germany with the horror of a man who understood the mechanism perfectly. The scale of collective shadow projection that the Nazi ideology represented, the degree to which a civilization had loaded its own darkness onto a scapegoat and then proceeded to enact the very brutality it attributed to the scapegoated, was, for Jung, the most terrifying confirmation of his theory of the shadow. Not a confirmation he was glad to have, confirmation that cost millions of lives and that he spent decades after the war trying to process and articulate. The shadow of a civilization, refused and unintegrated, does not simply fester. It detonates. And the detonation looks like history. The integration looks different. It looks like the specific, uncomfortable, ongoing moral work of a person or a culture that is willing to ask, what have we refused to see about ourselves? What have we been seeing in others that is actually ours? What darkness have we been carrying in the basement of our collective identity that is now pressing for acknowledgement? This is not comfortable work. It is not the work of self-criticism as performance. It is the deeper, more difficult, more necessary work of genuine, honest looking. The shadow asks for it. It will have it one way or another. There is a figure in the male psyche that is not him. She appears in dreams, in the inexplicable intensity of certain attractions, in the quality that makes a piece of music suddenly unbearable with a feeling that has no adequate name, in the moodiness that descends without warning and transforms the rational, competent man into something moved by currents he cannot identify or control, in the specific longing, not for any particular woman necessarily, but for something a particular woman seems to embody, something that is larger than the person and older than the feeling, and impossible to fully locate in any actual relationship. Jung calls her the anima, and in the female psyche there is a corresponding figure that is not her. He appears in the conviction, usually wrong, often destructive when acted on without reflection, that is not quite a thought but presents itself with the authority of thought, in the opinionated certainty that arrives without the backing of adequate evidence, in the dream figures who are powerful and knowing and directive, in the specific attractions to certain kinds of men who seem to carry, concentrated in their person, some quality of logos, of directed, purposive, world-engaging force that feels important in a way that resists full articulation. Jung calls him the animus. These are not metaphors, not merely literary devices for describing the complexity of desire or the influence of gender on personality. They are, in Jung's analysis, archetypes, structural features of the collective unconscious that express the psyche's relationship to its own contrasexual aspect, the part of every human being's psychological inheritance that represents not the dominant gender of the individual but the other, the inner opposite. The biological reasoning is secondary in Jung's account to the psychological one. The psychological claim is simply this: every human being's psyche contains structural templates for both feminine and masculine experience. Not in equal proportion, not without differentiation between the dominant gender identity and the inner other. But both are present, both are real, and the quality of a person's relationship with their own contrasexual inner figure has enormous consequences for how they experience love, relationships, creativity, and the deepest currents of their interior life. Let's stay with the anima because Jung wrote about it more extensively, from his position as a man examining his own interior. The anima is not a specific woman. She is a pattern, a structural potential, an inner feminine that is shaped partly by the individual's personal experience, by his mother, by the significant women of his development, by the specific emotional impressions that feminine presence has left in him, and partly by the collective inheritance, the great mother, the young maiden, the wise woman, the femme fatale. These archetypal faces of the feminine are available to every male psyche not through cultural learning alone, but through the collective unconscious. And the anima functions in the male psyche as the bridge between the conscious ego and the unconscious. She is the inner mediator, the figure through which the depth communicates with the surface. When a man dreams of a mysterious woman who seems to know things he does not know, who leads him into unfamiliar territory, who speaks in riddles, who embodies qualities he cannot articulate, he is encountering his anima. But here's the strange part. The anima is most dangerous when she is most invisible. When a man has no conscious relationship with his own inner feminine, no awareness that the figure exists, no practice of attending to the moods and images through which she communicates, she does not remain dormant. She finds expression. The most common channel is projection. He sees her in actual women, projects onto them the full weight of what the anima carries, and then relates to the actual woman as if she were the inner figure. This is the mechanism of infatuation at its most overwhelming. The sense that this specific woman is not just a person, but a portal, that she carries in concentrated form something vast and necessary, that life without her is unimaginable. The intensity of the feeling is real, but its object is partly the actual woman and partly and sometimes primarily the anima that has been projected onto her. When the actual woman fails to be the inner figure, which she inevitably will, because no actual person can sustain the weight of an archetype, the intensity that was experienced as love transforms into its shadow. Disappointment, sometimes contempt, sometimes the specific bitterness of the man who feels betrayed by the woman who failed to remain the extraordinary thing he was certain she was. He was not betrayed, he projected, and the projection lifted when the reality of the actual person became too present to be overwritten. Jung's point is not that love is always projection. It is that love in which the anima is unconsciously active, in which the inner figure is being projected without the man's awareness, is love that is partly about the actual person and partly about the man's own interior, and the inability to distinguish between the two is the source of some of the most intense and most destructive relational suffering available. The integration of the anima does not reduce the capacity for love, it clarifies it. The man who has developed a conscious relationship with his own inner feminine, who has attended to her, argued with her, been instructed by her, is capable of a love that is directed at the actual person rather than at the screen onto which the archetype has been projected. A love that can survive the actual person being actual. Now think about this for a moment from the other direction. The animus in the female psyche operates differently. Where the anima is primarily associated with mood and image and the quality of felt relatedness, the animus is associated with opinion and conviction and the quality of logos, of directed, articulated thought. Unintegrated, the animus speaks through the woman in the form of opinions that feel more certain than their evidence warrants. Blanket judgments, absolute statements, the conviction that arrives without adequate deliberation but presents itself as self-evident truth. This is not stupidity. It is the animus speaking through the woman who has not yet developed a conscious relationship with her own inner masculine. The logos aspect of the psyche, unintegrated, doesn't enable clear thinking. It produces the compulsive certainty that is the counterfeit of clear thinking. Integrated, met, worked with, brought into conscious relationship, the animus becomes exactly what it was prevented from being when projected. The capacity for genuine assertion, for the articulation of what is actually known, for the directed, purposive, world-engaging energy that is available to every human being regardless of gender. Both anima and animus integrated expand the person, make them more complete, less dependent on the other person to carry what they cannot yet acknowledge in themselves, less lonely in the deepest sense. Not because they no longer need others, because they are no longer entirely dependent on others to provide what they have refused to develop in themselves. The other inside becomes a resource, rather than a hunger. Every morning the performance begins, not the conscious, deliberate performance of an actor who knows they are playing a role, something more total and more invisible than that. The adjustment of voice, the calibration of expression, the specific configuration of manner and presentation that constitutes you in the eyes of the people whose eyes matter to the functioning of your day. The version of yourself that can navigate the office, the relationship, the social gathering, the professional interaction. Jung calls this the persona, the Latin word for the mask worn by actors in ancient theatre. The thing that shapes the sound, so persona, through which sound passes, the face worn toward the world, and the persona is not false. This must be said clearly, because the temptation when encountering the concept is to immediately conclude that the mask is the lie, and the face beneath it is the truth. Jung resists this. The persona is not the lie. It is the necessary mediating structure between the individual psyche and the demands of social existence. Without it, functioning in the social world would be impossible. Every social role, professional, parental, civic, relational, requires a degree of adaptation, a degree of shaping the expression of the self to the demands of the context. The persona is not the problem. The inflation of the persona is the problem. Persona inflation is the specific psychological condition in which the individual has identified so completely with the social mask that the distinction between the mask and the person wearing it has been lost. The persona is no longer something you wear. It is something you are, or rather, something you believe yourself to be. The actual self, with its depth and its contradictions, and its shadow and its anima, and its irreducible complexity, has been compressed into the dimensions of the social role. And the social role, however functional, is always smaller than the person. Think about the specific form this takes in the person of outstanding social success. The individual who has built a career, a reputation, a social identity of genuine accomplishment, who is recognized, who is respected, who has become, in the eyes of the world and increasingly in their own eyes, the role they have been performing. The successful lawyer, the admired teacher, the respected authority, the good parent, the reliable friend, from the outside, exemplary. From the inside, if the inside is honest, something is missing, something that does not have a name in the vocabulary of professional success, something that the achievement has not touched, that the recognition has not fed, that the accumulated social validation has not reached. This is the specific suffering of persona inflation, not the suffering of failure, the suffering of success that has not nourished what most needed nourishing. But here's the strange part. The persona and the shadow are, in Jung's analysis, intimately connected. They are produced by the same act. When the developing individual constructs the persona, selects the qualities that will constitute the presented self, they simultaneously create the shadow. Everything excluded from the persona goes into the shadow. They are two sides of one cut. This means that the more elaborately developed the persona, the more densely populated the shadow. The person of outstanding social performance, who has worked hardest and most successfully to present a specific, coherent, polished identity, is also the person with the most material in the basement, the most energy invested in exclusion, the most pressure building behind the walls, and the midlife crisis, the phenomenon that Jung was among the first to identify as a distinct and significant psychological event, is, in his analysis, substantially the moment when the shadow makes its bid to be heard. When the material that has been excluded in the construction of the persona accumulates to the point where the persona can no longer contain it, when the walls develop cracks, when the life that looked correct from the outside begins to feel, from the inside, like the wrong life, not wrong in any specifiable way, wrong in the way that a garment that fits perfectly but was made for someone else feels wrong, technically correct, personally inaccurate. Now think about this for a moment. There is a particular kind of psychological emergency that follows the collapse of the persona. Jung encountered it repeatedly in his clinical practice. The person who has identified so completely with the social role that when the role is threatened, by job loss, by professional failure, by retirement, by the end of a relationship that was a major constituent of the identity, the threat to the role is experienced as a threat to existence itself. Because if you are the role, and the role is gone, what remains? This is the question that persona inflation makes catastrophic, because the answer, that what remains is the actual person, with all the depth and complexity and shadow and anima and unexplored potential that the persona was never large enough to contain, is not available to the person who has been the persona so thoroughly that they have lost contact with everything beneath it. The therapeutic work, and Jung's entire psychological method is, in a sense, a method for this, is the restoration of that contact. Not the destruction of the persona, not the abandonment of social roles, but the re-establishment of the relationship between the persona and the actual self that the persona is supposed to serve. The actor who knows they are playing a role can play it with full commitment and then set it down. The actor who has forgotten they are playing a role cannot set it down, cannot rest from it, cannot be anything other than the role even when the role has left the building. The re-establishment of the distinction, or the recovery of the self beneath the performance, is what individuation begins with. The recognition that you are not what you have been presenting, that you are something larger, something older, something more contradictory and more alive than the coherent social identity that has been so carefully maintained. This recognition is not comfortable. It is often terrifying. The familiar structure is suddenly revealed as a structure, as a construction rather than a given. And in the space between the structure and whatever it was built over, the collective unconscious begins to speak. In dreams, in fantasy, in the irrational intensities and the symbolic images that the conscious mind, in its persona-maintaining mode, has been efficiently editing out. The mask develops a crack, and through the crack the depth shows itself, not all at once, not safely, not on any schedule that the conscious ego would have chosen, but it shows itself. And the question of what to do with what shows itself, how to engage with the depth that the persona has been covering, is the question at the centre of Jung's entire psychology. The question of individuation, which is where we are going next. You have seen them without knowing what you were seeing. In the film that moved you in a way you could not explain by reference to craft alone, not just the good acting, not just the beautiful cinematography, not just the intelligent screenplay, but something beneath all of that, a resonance, a feeling that the story was not only a story, that it was pointing at something older and larger than itself, that the figures in it were not only characters but something more. In the myth you encountered in school that stayed with you when everything else faded, the story of Odysseus losing his way and finding it, the story of Persephone descending into the underworld and returning, the story of Prometheus stealing fire and paying forever, the story of the hero who must face the dragon, the story of the child abandoned and then called to greatness, in the religious imagery that retains its power over people who no longer believe literally in what it depicts, the Pieta, the mother holding the dead son, that moves even the committed atheist, the image of resurrection, of death and return to life, that appears not only in Christianity but in every tradition sophisticated enough to notice the cycle of the seasons, the figure of the divine child, the wise elder, the sacred marriage. These are not arbitrary cultural products. They are not simply what people happen to invent in their particular times and places. They are the archetypes of the collective unconscious, expressing themselves through the medium of human creativity, the structural templates pressing up through the surface of culture, finding the specific forms that each culture and each moment makes available, but retaining beneath those specific forms the universal structure that is not cultural but human. Jung spent decades documenting this, not just in mythology and religion, in alchemy, in Gnostic texts, in medieval Christian mysticism, in Eastern philosophy, in the fairy tales of European tradition, in the symbols of people across every continent. Everywhere he looked, he found the same patterns, not identical, not copies of each other, but expressions of the same underlying archetypes, shaped into the idiom of each particular tradition. The hero, every culture has it, the individual, often of unusual birth or unusual capacity, who is called to a journey that is also a transformation, who faces trials that are simultaneously external obstacles and internal confrontations, who encounters helpers and enemies that are, at the archetypal level, aspects of the psyche rather than merely external forces, who descends into something, a dark forest, an underworld, a period of imprisonment or exile or death, and returns transformed, bringing back something that was not available before the descent. This is not just a popular narrative structure. It is, Jung argues, the narrative structure of psychic development itself. The hero's journey is the template for what happens to the psyche when it grows, when it expands beyond the boundaries of the existing ego identity and integrates something new. The trials are real. They are the genuine resistance of the established self to the expansion that growth requires. The descent is real. It is the encounter with the unconscious, with the shadow and the anima, and the deeper contents that the surface self has not yet met. The return is real. It is the reintegration of the expanded self, carrying back into ordinary life the goods of the inner journey. Joseph Campbell, drawing extensively on Jung, called this the monomyth, the one story that all the stories are telling. Whether or not you accept that formulation in its strong form, something is clearly going on. The repetition of the pattern is too consistent, too universal, too deep in the bones of human narrative to be explained by coincidence or simple cultural diffusion. But here's the strange part. The archetypes are not only visible in art and myth, they are active in ordinary life, present in the most mundane experiences, if those experiences are attended to with sufficient depth of perception. The moment in a person's life when everything changes, when the stable structure of the existing identity is challenged by something that cannot be accommodated within it. A loss, a revelation, an encounter, a failure, a love, something that arrives with a weight disproportionate to its apparent cause. That carries, in Jung's language, an archetypal charge. That activates not just the personal response, but something collective beneath the personal, something ancient beneath the contemporary. The person who encounters this, who feels the disproportionate weight, who senses that what is happening is larger than what it appears to be, is encountering the collective unconscious pressing through the particular circumstances of their individual life. The archetype using the personal situation as its vehicle, the ancient pattern finding expression in the modern life, and the question of how to respond, whether to experience the weight as purely personal and therefore try to explain it in personal terms alone, or whether to receive it as what it partly is, as the activation of something structural and universal, is the question of whether the collective unconscious gets to be acknowledged or remains invisible behind the personal interpretation. Jung's argument is that the invisible archetype is more powerful than the acknowledged one. The pattern that is operating without your awareness has more influence over your behavior precisely because you cannot see it. The hero archetype activated in a person who has no concept of the hero archetype is simply experienced as an inexplicable compulsion towards certain kinds of risk or sacrifice or quest. The person is moved by the archetype without knowing it. They are, in the technical sense, possessed by it. Consciousness, the specific kind of consciousness that comes from knowing the archetypal patterns, does not neutralize the archetypes. It changes the relationship to them, moves the person from being moved without knowing what is moving them to being moved with some awareness of what is moving them. From being the character in the story without knowing you are in a story to something that is not quite the author, the archetype remains larger than the individual, but is at least a participant who knows approximately what is happening. This is not mastery, it is not control. It is, in Jung's word, relationship. The conscious relationship with the collective unconscious, the ongoing, never completed, never fully resolved engagement between the individual ego and the depth beneath it. And it is this relationship, the specific, demanding, richly productive relationship between the individual self and the collective inheritance it carries, that Jung calls individuation. Not the becoming of an isolated individual cut off from the collective, the becoming of a self that is fully individual precisely because it is in genuine relationship with what is universal. The wave, fully itself, knowing it is made of ocean. Something happens to you that has no rational explanation. Not a supernatural event, not the kind of thing that requires the abandonment of all causal reasoning. Something more subtle and more disturbing. A coincidence so precise, so timely, so exactly fitted to the interior situation you are in, that the word coincidence begins to feel inadequate. Not because you believe in magic, but because the fit between the inner event and the outer event is too exact to be dismissed with comfortable ease. You think of someone you haven't thought of in years and they call within the hour. You're in the middle of a crisis about a decision and a book falls open to the exact passage you needed. You dream of something and wake to find its analogue in the world. The symbol that has been appearing in your inner life with increasing insistence appears unexpectedly in the world outside. These things happen. They happen to people who are not credulous, not mystically inclined, not predisposed to find meaning where there is none. They happen to scientists and skeptics and people who have spent their lives in the service of rational inquiry. And they happen, Jung observed, with particular frequency and particular intensity during periods of significant psychological transition. When the unconscious is active, when the deep processes of the psyche are in motion, when something is changing in the interior in ways that the conscious mind has not yet fully registered. Jung called this synchronicity, and he defined it with care, the meaningful coincidence of an outer event and an inner state, where no causal connection can be demonstrated. Not causation, meaning. This is the crucial distinction. Jung is not claiming that the thought caused the phone call. He is not proposing any mechanism by which inner states produce outer events. He is proposing something different and, in some ways, more philosophically challenging. That meaning, the felt sense of significance, of fitting, of one thing speaking to another, is not always reducible to causal connection. that the universe, or at least human experience of the universe, sometimes exhibits a structure of meaningful correspondence that is not the same as the causal structure of physical events. He developed this idea in collaboration with Wolfgang Pauli, one of the founding figures of quantum mechanics, a Nobel laureate, a man who came to Jung for psychological reasons and stayed for philosophical ones. Pauli was troubled by the appearance, in his own experience, of exactly the kind of synchronistic events that Jung was documenting. As a physicist, he could not explain them. As a human being, he could not dismiss them. The collaboration between the psychologist and the physicist produced one of the strangest and most important intellectual partnerships of the 20th century. What they arrived at, tentatively and with full awareness of the speculative nature of the claim, was the suggestion that the psyche and the physical world are not two completely separate domains occasionally running in parallel. That at some level, a level that neither classical physics nor classical psychology has adequate tools to describe, they share a common ground, a common substrate in which the distinction between inner and outer has not yet been fully established. The collective unconscious, in this reading, is not merely inside the human psyche, it is the meeting point between the psyche and the world, the layer at which what is most deeply human and what is most deeply real about the structure of existence converge. But here's the strange part. You do not have to accept this metaphysical speculation to take synchronicity seriously as a psychological phenomenon, because what Jung is pointing at, whatever its ultimate nature, is something that functions in psychological life with real consequences. The person who has developed a conscious relationship with their inner life, who attends to dreams, to the movements of the unconscious, to the symbolic dimensions of their experience, begins to notice the synchronicities more readily. Not because they are happening more frequently, because the attention to the inner world creates a sensitivity to the correspondences that inattention leaves invisible, and the synchronicities attended to function as communications. As the collective unconscious making itself known not only through the interior channels of dream and fantasy, but through the exterior world, as if the depth of the psyche and the depth of reality are, at their most fundamental level, less separate than ordinary experience suggests. Think about what this does to the idea of meaning. The modern secular worldview, the worldview that has been dominant in Western culture since the Enlightenment, is committed, at its foundation, to the idea that meaning is a human imposition on a universe that is, in itself, meaningless. Stuff happens. Causes produce effects. The human mind, with its extraordinary capacity for pattern recognition and narrative construction, imposes stories on the causal sequence and calls the stories meaning. But the meaning is not in the world, it is in the human mind looking at the world. Synchronicity challenges this, not by proposing a return to pre-scientific animism, not by suggesting that the universe is governed by divine intention in the conventional religious sense, but by suggesting that the relationship between human consciousness and the world it inhabits is not as purely one-directional as the secular model assumes. That meaning is not only projected onto the world from inside the human mind, that the world, or at least the interface between world and mind, sometimes participates in the meaning, sometimes responds, sometimes speaks, in a language made of coincidence, in the timing that is too exact, in the symbol that appears on both sides of the boundary between inner and outer simultaneously. Jung did not claim to know the mechanism. He was too scientifically honest to claim more than the phenomenon warranted, but he insisted on taking the phenomenon seriously, on not explaining it away before it had been fully described, on sitting with the discomfort of the unexplained rather than forcing it into a frame that diminishes it. Because the unexplained synchronicity, genuinely attended to, genuinely received, can function as a point of contact between the individual and something larger than the individual, between the personal psyche and the collective, between the finite self and the depth from which it emerged. And that contact, whatever its ultimate nature, is one of the most significant experiences available to the human being in the process of individuation. The world in those moments is not indifferent. It is not speaking in words, not in reasons, not in the language of cause and effect. But something is happening, something that means something. And the question of what it means, and whether the meaning is in you or in the world or in the place where the two are, at their deepest level, the same thing, is a question that synchronicity asks without answering, as Jung intended. There is a process that Jung believed was the central purpose of the second half of human life, not achievement, not the accumulation of experience or wisdom or wealth or relationship. not the completion of the projects that the first half of life began. Something different from all of these, something that begins, if it begins at all, because it is not automatic, not guaranteed, not produced simply by living long enough, in the specific crisis that the first half of life eventually produces, the crisis of the self that has been well constructed and finds itself hollow. The midlife confrontation with the gap between the persona that has been successfully built and the soul that was never fully included in the construction. The moment when the life that looks right from the outside begins to feel, from the inside, like the wrong life. When the achievements do not satisfy, when the roles do not fit, when the depth begins to press insistently against the surface. This is the beginning of individuation. Jung defines it with characteristic precision. Individuation is the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, a separate, indivisible unity, a whole, not the becoming of an isolated self, cut off from others and from the collective, but the becoming of a self that is genuinely and distinctly its own, a self that has related to its shadow and integrated its darkness, that has developed a conscious relationship with its anima or animus, that has loosened the identification with the persona without abandoning the functional persona, that has engaged with the deepest layer of the psyche, the self, which Jung distinguishes carefully from the ego, and found in that engagement not the dissolution of the individual, but its genuine fulfillment. The ego is the center of consciousness, the organizing structure of ordinary waking experience. The I that thinks and plans and decides, the self, capitalized, distinguished, is the totality of the psyche. The organizing principle of the whole, not just the conscious part but the unconscious part, not just the persona but the shadow, not just the ego but everything beneath and around the ego that the ego has not yet integrated and may never fully integrate. The self, in Jung's vision, is the center that the ego is not. The larger organization that was there before the ego formed and that is trying, through the whole process of psychological development, to express itself more fully through the medium of the individual life. Individuation is the process of the ego coming into relationship with the self, not the ego becoming the self, that would be the inflation that is the opposite of individuation, but the ego discovering that it's not the whole show, that it is the visible tip of something vast and deep and only partially known, and orienting itself in relation to that vastness rather than pretending the vastness does not exist. But here's the strange part. The process of individuation is not linear, not a curriculum with a known ending, not a therapeutic protocol with measurable outcomes. It is an engagement with the unconscious that is, in principle, lifelong, that goes as deep as the person can go and is always capable of going deeper, that has genuinely dangerous passages, places where the encounter with the collective unconscious is overwhelming enough to threaten the integrity of the conscious personality, and genuinely illuminating ones. And its fruits are not the fruits that the first half of life was oriented toward. Not success, in the ordinary sense, not the approval of others, not the achievement of external goals, however genuine and valuable those achievements may be. The fruits are interior, the specific quality of a person who has become more fully themselves, who has met their own darkness and related to it rather than projecting it, who has developed a genuine relationship with the depth, who has moved from being driven by forces they do not understand to being in genuine dialogue with those forces, not mastering them, not suppressing them, but knowing them, being known by them. The quality of presence that results from this work is not easily described. It is more easily recognized. In the person who has done it, or who is doing it, because it is never finally done, there is a specific kind of solidity. Not the solidity of the person who has armored themselves against experience. The opposite of that. The solidity of the person who has become large enough to hold their contradictions, who does not need to project their shadow because they know it is theirs, who does not need the other person to carry their anima or animus because they have developed a relationship with it themselves, who does not need the persona to be the self because they have found something beneath the persona that is actually more self. Think about this in relation to the collective, because individuation is not only a personal process. It is, in Jung's vision, the contribution that the individual makes to the collective. The person who has individuated, who has become genuinely and distinctly themselves, adds to the collective something that was not there before. A specific, irreplaceable perspective. A particular way of seeing and feeling and understanding that is the product of this one person's engagement with the totality of their experience including the collective unconscious they carry. The collective does not evolve through the mass, it evolves through individuals, through the person who goes far enough into their own depth to bring something back that was not previously available at the surface. The artist, the philosopher, the healer, the innovator who has been genuinely original is someone who has had genuine contact with the collective unconscious and has found a way to bring its contents into form that the collective can receive. This is not elitism. It is not a claim that certain people are more valuable than others. It is a claim about the direction of cultural renewal, about where the new forms come from, about why genuine originality is always somewhat shocking, because it arrives from a place that the existing cultural consensus had not yet reached, from the collective unconscious pressing up through an individual consciousness that was open enough to receive it and strong enough to carry it back. Jung believed this was what the second half of life was for. After the achievement of the first half, the building of the persona, the establishment of the social identity, the accomplishment of the tasks that social existence required, the second half was for the other work, the inner work, the work of becoming, finally, the person that all the external achieving had been in service of, whether or not the achieving self knew it. This is a deeply unfashionable claim in a culture that treats the second half of life as primarily a period of decline, as the beginning of the end rather than the beginning of something that the first half could not have produced. Jung insists the second half is not decline, it is descent, and descent is not the same as decline. Decline is moving toward less, descent is moving toward depth, toward the ocean beneath every mind, toward what was there before you were born, toward what does not belong to you personally and therefore cannot be taken from you personally, toward the collective inheritance that is your deepest ground and your most ancient home. Jung made a claim about religion that satisfied almost nobody. It was too psychological for the believers and too spiritual for the materialists, too willing to take religious experience seriously for the rationalists who wanted it explained away, and too unwilling to affirm the literal truth of religious doctrines for the theologians who wanted it defended. He did not seem to mind. His claim, stated plainly, is this: religious experience is real. What it points at is real. What it points at is not what the doctrines of any particular religion say it is. What it points at is the self, the totality of the psyche, the organizing center of the whole, the depth that is deeper than the ego and older than the persona and more comprehensive than anything consciousness has yet reached. The experience of God, genuine, direct, overwhelming religious experience, the kind that people across every tradition describe in remarkably similar terms, is, in Jung's analysis, the experience of the self. Not a delusion, not a wish fulfillment, not a regression to infantile dependency. A genuine encounter with a real dimension of the psyche that is, in its vastness, in its autonomy, in its capacity to overwhelm and transform the individual ego, genuinely numinous, genuinely other, genuinely deserving of the category of the sacred, the numinous. This word, borrowed from the theologian Rudolf Otto, is one of Jung's most important tools. Otto had described the experience of the holy, the mysterium tremendum et fascinant, the mystery that is both terrifying and fascinating, as a specific quality of experience that cannot be reduced to any other category. Not aesthetic, not moral, not intellectual, something unique, the specific quality of encounter with something that is simultaneously overwhelming in its power and magnetic in its fascination, that produces both awe and attraction, that is recognized as other, as genuinely exceeding the ordinary parameters of experience, and yet is felt as deeply significant, deeply connected to the deepest currents of the self. Jung says, this experience is what the encounter with the collective unconscious feels like, when it is genuine, when the depth opens beneath the ordinary ego consciousness and something from the archetypal level breaks through, when the self, the greater organization of the whole psyche, makes its presence felt to the limited ego that normally occupies the foreground of experience. This is what the mystics of every tradition have been describing. The Christian mystics' union with God, the Buddhists' enlightenment, the Sufis' annihilation in the divine, the shaman's descent and return. These are not identical experiences. The specific content, the specific imagery, the specific conceptual framework varies enormously with the cultural and individual context. But the underlying psychological structure, the encounter between the limited ego and the much vaster depth beneath it, the experience of something that is both other and more fully oneself than the ordinary self, the quality of numinosity, this is consistent across the variety, because it is the encounter with the collective unconscious, with the archetypes at their deepest level, with the self. But here's the strange part. If religious experience is the experience of the self, if what the mystics have been encountering is a dimension of their own psyche, does this mean God is merely psychological? Does this reduce the sacred to the subjective? Does it deflate the claim of religious experience by locating it inside the human mind, rather than in an external divine reality? Jung anticipated this objection and refused it, not by asserting the existence of God in the theological sense. That was not his territory, and he knew it. But by questioning the assumption that what is psychological is therefore merely psychological, that the interior is merely interior. He argues, we have no way of knowing whether the self that is encountered in profound religious experience corresponds to something beyond the psyche or not. The experience is real, its psychological reality is beyond question. Its content, the vastness, the numinosity, the quality of encountering something that exceeds the ego, is psychologically real in the most rigorous sense. But whether the psychological reality is all there is, or whether it is the interior face of something that also has an exterior face, whether the depth of the psyche opens into something beyond the psyche, this question is not one that psychology can answer. Jung remains, on this point, genuinely agnostic. Not the comfortable agnosticism of someone who doesn't care, the uncomfortable agnosticism of someone who cares enormously and has looked as carefully as looking allows, and cannot honestly go further than the evidence reaches. He said in a famous television interview when asked whether he believed in God, "I don't need to believe, I know." He was not claiming certainty about the existence of a personal deity. He was saying that the encounter, whatever its ultimate nature, was direct, was not a matter of belief or inference or argument, was experienced, and the experience, whatever it was of, was not in doubt. The numinous was real, what it was of remained open. This is, in a sense, the most honest position available to a person who has genuinely encountered the depth, who has not merely thought about it, but has been in it, has been moved by it, has had the experience that every tradition calls encounter with the sacred. The honest position is not the assertion of the full theological framework. It is not the dismissal of the experience as merely subjective. It is the maintenance of the experience's reality alongside the humility of not knowing more than the experience itself reveals. Now, think about what this means for the modern person who has lost the religious framework. The person who can no longer believe in the literal doctrines of the tradition in which they were formed, who cannot in intellectual honesty affirm the historical claims that the tradition requires, who has been, in Jung's phrase, deprived of their symbols, cut off from the living images through which the collective unconscious was able to speak to previous generations. This person is not, in Jung's analysis, simply fortunate to have escaped superstition. They are, in a specific and significant sense, impoverished, not because the doctrines were true, but because the symbols through which the archetypes found expression, the rituals through which the encounter with the collective unconscious was safely mediated, these have been taken away without replacement. The depth does not disappear because the symbols are gone. The archetypes do not retire because the culture no longer provides adequate vehicles for their expression. They find other channels, less controlled channels. The individual who has lost the religious framework but has not developed a conscious relationship with the collective unconscious does not escape the archetypes. They are possessed by them without the mediating structures that religion, at its best, provided. The gods, as Jung puts it, become diseases. The energy that was organized and channeled by the religious symbol becomes the compulsion, the addiction, the ideological possession, the political fanaticism, the irrational enthusiasm or irrational terror that erupts in the life of the individual or the culture that has lost its symbols. The sacred does not disappear. It goes underground. And underground, without the mediation of conscious engagement, it is more dangerous than it was when it was named, ritualized, met at the altar. The loss of religion is not a problem to be solved by returning to belief. It is a challenge to develop a new kind of relationship with the depth, a more conscious relationship, a relationship that does not require the literal truth of the doctrines, but does require the honesty to acknowledge that what the doctrines were pointing at, the numinous, the collective, the self, is real and demands engagement. We have travelled a long way through very deep water, through the architecture of the unconscious and the structure of the archetypes, through the shadow and the anima and the persona and the self, through individuation and synchronicity and the psychology of religious experience, through the extraordinary, demanding, never-completed project of becoming more fully oneself by becoming more fully related to what is larger than the self, and we arrive at the end of the argument in a place that is not a conclusion. Jung did not believe in conclusions. not for the questions that matter most. He believed in ongoing engagement, continuing dialogue, the relationship with the depth that deepens as you are willing to go deeper. That reveals more as you bring more honest attention. That does not resolve into a final answer, but opens, with each genuine engagement, into further questions. The collective unconscious is not a theory you can accept and then put aside. It is, if it is real, and Jung spent a lifetime accumulating evidence that something like it is real, a feature of your actual situation, a dimension of what you actually are. Not a fascinating speculation about human nature in general, but a claim about your nature, about the specific, particular, irreplaceable person that you are. You're not only what you remember, not only what you have learned, not only the product of your personal history and your cultural formation and the specific accidents of circumstance that have shaped you. You're also the expression in this particular life of patterns that are millions of years old, of images and narratives and emotional potentials that were being shaped in the earliest human communities, that have been expressed in every tradition that has been deep enough and old enough to develop the symbolic vocabulary for them, that are present in you as structural predispositions, as the potential to encounter the hero and the shadow, and the wise old man and the great mother and the trickster and the self, not because you have learned them, but because you are made of them. Now think about this for a moment. Really sit with it. This does not diminish the individual. It does not reduce you to a type or a pattern or a mere instance of something universal. The archetype is the potential. The life is the expression. And the expression, the specific, unique, irreplaceable way in which the universal pattern takes form in this particular consciousness, this particular history, this particular set of choices and encounters and moments of darkness and moments of light, is yours alone. No one else will ever express these potentials in exactly this combination. No one else carries exactly this shadow, exactly this anima, exactly this version of the persona built over exactly this depth. The universality of the collective unconscious does not erase individuality. It is the ground from which individuality grows, the ocean from which each wave rises, and each wave is real. Each wave is distinct. Each wave has its particular shape, its particular energy, or its particular moment of rising and cresting and returning. The fact that it is made of ocean does not make it less a wave. It makes it possible for it to be a wave at all. But here's the strange part. The wave that does not know it is made of ocean is also the wave that is most terrified of dissolving, that clutches at its own form, that resists the returning, that experiences the pull of the depth as threat rather than as home. The wave that knows it is made of ocean can rise and crest and return without the existential terror of the unknowing wave. Not because the returning is painless, not because the dissolution is not real, but because the ocean that the wave returns to is not nothing, is not loss, is the same substance from which the wave emerged and from which the next wave will rise. This is not a consolation about death. Jung is not offering a cheap comfort about survival after death. He is offering something more precise and more honest. The collective unconscious is not immortality under the personal sense. It does not guarantee the continuation of this particular ego identity, this particular persona, this particular arrangement of personal history and preference and memory. What it offers is something different. The recognition that the individual is not only individual, that beneath the biography, beneath the persona, beneath the personal history, there is a layer of being that is not personal. That was there before you arrived and will be there when you are gone. Not you in any personal sense, but the ground of you, the substrate, the ocean, and the relationship with that ground, the conscious, honest, engaged relationship with the collective unconscious, is the closest thing Jung found to what the religious traditions call eternal life, not the continuation of the ego. The recognition, while the ego still exists and is still fully operative, that the ego is not all there is, that you are more than your biography, that the depth beneath your personal history is real and it is vast, and it has been the source of everything that the human species has ever recognized as most deeply significant, its art, its religion, its most profound expressions of love and justice and meaning. The collective unconscious is not inside you in the way that a piece of furniture is inside a room. You are inside it. It is the larger container, the ocean in which every individual mind swims, the substrate from which every culture grows, the ground from which every genuine religious experience, every artistic breakthrough, every moment of genuine contact between one human being and the depth of another has emerged, and it is accessible. That is the extraordinary thing, not easily, not safely always, not without the willingness to go into territory that the defending ego finds threatening, but accessible, through the dream that you attend to rather than dismiss, through the symbol that you engage with rather than explain away, through the shadow that you integrate rather than project, through the depth of your own interior, entered honestly, attended to faithfully, related to with the specific courage that honesty about the inside requires. Jung spent his entire career mapping this territory, not because he had found all the answers, because he could not stop looking, could not stop following the images and the symbols and the dreams and the synchronicities and the clinical evidence into the depth that kept opening beneath each layer of understanding. He said late in his life that the older he got, the less he felt he understood, not as a confession of failure, as the specific wisdom of the person who has looked long enough to know that the territory is genuinely vast, that each layer of genuine understanding reveals the depth of what has not yet been understood, that the ocean does not have a bottom that any finite mind can reach, but the looking matters, the engagement matters, the willingness to attend to the dream you did not invent, to take seriously the image that arrived from somewhere you did not recognize, the feeling that pointed at something you could not name, matters. Not because it will deliver you from the difficulties of being human, not because the collective unconscious will solve the problems that consciousness cannot solve, but because the engagement with the depth is, for Jung, what being fully human means, the refusal to live only on the surface, the willingness to be more than the persona, the ongoing, costly, richly rewarding project of the wave, knowing what it is made of, and knowing, genuinely, directly, in the specific way that is not belief but experience, that the ocean is real, that it was there before you arrived, that every human being who has ever lived has swum in the same water, that the dreams of ancient people and the dreams you had last night are made of the same substance, that you are not alone in the depth, that you never were, that the loneliness of the surface, the specific modern secular loneliness of the individual who has lost their symbols and their community and their relationship with the collective, is not the deepest truth about what you are. The deepest truth is the ocean, and you have always been part of it. You are part of it now, in the reading of these words, in the recognition, if it is there, and perhaps it is, perhaps that is why you are still here, that something in this is not new information, that something in this is memory, the oldest memory, the one that does not belong to you personally, the one that belongs to all of us, together in the deep.